it had the grounding document attached.
Yes, I have that because I have it open, Beth, so thank you.
Okay. We were just thinking it'd be more efficient to add them in the meeting invite.
I just say accept, so I don't really keep track of like who the old ones and the new ones.
Perfect.
I'm the same way. I was like, I just accepted, and then yeah.
You guys are like, again, she's sending something again.
No, it's just I feel like with the splintering and then like Kristen's stuff, I'm like right now, I'm like, there's like so many invites. I just like put it on my calendar and I'm like, I'll figure it out later. Sorry,
Idra, that's the same way with I am. I'm like, okay, just accept and we'll go from there.
Yeah, because otherwise, if I ignore it, then it's not on my calendar, and then like it's like, oh no. So yeah. So I'm sorry. That's my COVID team.
Whatever works. Awesome. So I think we're waiting for a couple more folks, but not sure. Everybody's schedules are a little bit crazy right now. I guess like they usually are. So just appreciative of all of you that could make it. I know in kind of in the middle, right smack in the middle of the day. Hope you are staying hydrated. Good job, Holly. I see you sipping on your coffee. That you have your snacks. Oh, look, everybody's got something close by. Jim, I'm looking at your backdrop. You've got a funny little character in the back there hanging out with us today. Cute.
That is a very gay piñata.
A piñata. Okay. That's going to be fun.
There it is.
Okay, so we will go ahead and just check in. Again, what's nice about being in these smaller groups is the opportunity to connect more, right? And engage with each other and have more fluid conversations outside of like a really big group setting. So this is our second meeting as part of the standards work. So a couple of us met last week and just kind of started thinking about what standards we might want to look at, because we do have the opportunity kind of to be in the exploration phase of the work, since one of our milestones is not up until significantly later. So as opposed to the engagement group, which has a lot of heavy lift very, very early on. So with that, we kind of co-constructed our agenda for today, last time that we met. And before we get started, if we could all just share our name, our pronouns, our role, the organization that we're in. And then our check-in today is, what punctuation captures how you're feeling right now? So think about all those punctuation marks and what seems to fit or be a match for how you're entering our space together. And whoever wants to go first can jump in. Okay, I'll go first. Vanessa Martinez, SEL specialist at ODE. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And if I were a punctuation, I'm looking at my keyboard right now. I am kind of resonating with the idea of an exclamation point, just because it's that mad rush and dash to the finish line. We're preparing for the advisory group and just a lot culminating all at the same time. And so it just feels like I'm excited for that big exclamation point to be over with so that we can have a little bit of calm. These days leading up to it can be a little intense. So I like the intensity of the exclamation point right now.
I'll go next. I'm feeling like kind of the asterisks for me because our spring break at UP is next week and I'm going out of town and I'm sort of piecing out, but it's a very weird time in a lot of my other sectors that other people are not taking a break. So I feel like a lot of my things are like asterisks. I'm going to be out of town next week. And people are like, oh, okay. Why are you out of town? So I feel like the asterisk is my punctuation right now.
You skipped a whole part, Deidre.
What part?
Your name.
Oh, God. Sorry. I'm Deirdre Hahn, she, her, and I'm from University of Portland,
Where are you going? That's what I want to know.
Paris.
Paris? So Deidre, I'm doing some research because and this is another side conversation, but my stepmother is taking us to Europe this summer and we want to start in Paris for a couple days. So if you have any recommendations on where to stay, I'd love to put it in the chat.
Oh, where to stay? Gosh, I have no idea. I have a friend that lives there.
Oh, you're so
So I always get that host piece of it. But maybe I'll reach out with things to do, but places to stay, I always go to the same place.
Yeah, I've been there 3 times, but not with young men.
Oh,
Yeah, teens. So anyway, but I derailed. Holly Dalton, Senior Manager of Social Emotional Early Learning. I'm feeling like a backslash, doing a little bit of everything and all jumbled together, but not very well. She, her, hers. Did that out of order as well. Vanessa, you speak French as well? Because I took it for 9 years.
Jim, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Jim Hansen. He, him, his. I have a couple of roles. The first is the school psychologist here at Lincoln High School behind me. And in that role, I've been fortunate enough to be heavily involved in our MTSS, our SEL instruction at all of the tiers, including the upper tiers for mental health. And the other part of my job is working for student success and health in Portland Public Schools as their school-based dialectical behavioral therapy project coordinator. And now we have DBT in 7 of our high schools and 1 of our middle schools. We're looking to grow more evidence-based, trauma-informed, strength-based interventions around SEL. Oh, and I would say that I'm a semicolon because everything connects.
I like that attitude.
Yeah, like that. All right, I will bring us home. So I am Beth Wiggum. I work at the Oregon Department of Education. I go by she, her, hers. My position supports school counseling programs and career and college readiness across the state. And if I could be a punctuation mark today in this moment with how I'm feeling, I would say probably it's the symbol above the 6, which is that I had to look it up, so please don't make fun of me. You can make fun of me if you want. It's called a wedge. And the reason why I pick that is because I think of that to the nth degree of something. And I'm feeling like when I looked it up, it said it can be kind of like two arguments. So I'm feeling really stressed out at the moment, kind of like Vanessa with everything that's going on, and also really, really excited at the same time. So I kind of feel like these 2 things are happening, are true for me. And yeah, so that's it for me.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone, for sharing. It's so nice. Even just the punctuation, look what it brought up. Some of us speak French. I found out what a wedge is. Didn't know that was what that was. Very cool. Okay, so we will launch in. So just to review our intentions, we're looking at this big essential question of what should the standards include and how should we approach their development. So that's kind of always our guiding frame, and the essential question we're just going to keep there at the forefront, because that's what our charge is in this group, is to determine what that will look like. And as part of that work, specific to today, we're going to be focusing on reviewing some of the standards that are already in place that do connect with SEL. So we had identified looking at health standards and then also the counseling program standards, and just to see where there's some natural connections and just to be aware of where things SEL is fitting already in some of the standards across the state. So we're going to actually hold off on the health piece because we're going to invite Suzanne Kitty, who is the health specialist, to come at next meeting so she can kind of highlight and share where she sees that connected work. And really for us to kind of get a sense of how these standards are already integrated in some of these content areas. Hi, Jill. Welcome.
Sorry.
Good to see you.
Yeah, sorry, everybody.
No, no
In another
worries.
meeting.
Beth, if Beth will put the agenda in the chat, and we're just reviewing our intentions right now, Jill. And then our hope is to look at some of the highlighted states that we had determined were possible places to look towards. So we had identified Illinois and Massachusetts. So we'll spend some time kind of reviewing those and capturing our initial thoughts about what's standing out to us. What do we like about it? What might be missing? And just generate some initial thoughts. And then the last piece of our time today is really thinking about on the February 28th meeting, which is next Monday, what is it that we want to elevate or surface or bring up when we meet with the other groups? So there will be opportunities to do that through small group sharing and dialogue. So we want to be thoughtful about what are some things, there might be tension points or questions or things that we want to bring back to the whole group. So making space for that. And we also have some initial questions that the engagement group has been working towards that we want to share with you and see if they're feeling like the information that would be gathered from those questions would be helpful for you all to consider as you think about what the standards will include and how to develop them. So any questions about those things or things that need to be added to our agenda?
Sounds good.
All right. Seeing some head nods. Onward.
Mhm.
Okay, so like I said, health, we're going to push back for a little bit because we're going to invite Suzanne to come in, and she's got a whole crosswalk of just different ways in which the SEL standards are showing up in health. She could not make it today. She had a personal appointment. So we will be inviting her at an upcoming meeting. But we do have with us Beth Wiggum, who is very familiar with the Oregon Counseling Program adopted standards. So she's just kind of gonna walk through what connections relate to the SEL work that we're embarking on.
I realize I'm muted, sorry. So I am going to put in the chat really quickly. I think the link that was put in last time took you to the national one, but I'm going to share with you Oregon. So Oregon did adopt the American School Counselor Association student standards for school counseling programs. And just a reminder, school counseling programs are required and in every district at the district level and at the school level. So it's required for both for school counseling programs. And so the standards, districts and schools have to show how they're providing the standards for school counseling programs for students across all their entire school. So the standards, these standards that I put in the chat have been adopted by the state. And so these have to be implemented. And so what you see is all the standards. The first are mindsets that we want students to be able to have and to grow into. And then below are like the behavioral types of standards. So you'll see kind of the learning strategies, the self-management skills and social skills. So these are kind of like the different areas under behavior, under that category. And it talks about how it can be delivered through classroom lessons, activities, or individual group settings. And so these are some ways that they're already being delivered. And so we usually, when I work with schools or districts, have them attach things that they're already doing to the standards and then identify where there's gaps and then how are they addressing those gaps in the standards. And so these were adopted in 2018. And the way that socio-emotional learning is done through these standards is that it's a domain that that is woven throughout every single one of the standards. So if you look at these standards through the domain of socio-emotional learning, You'll start to see how they relate to things that we want students to, the knowledge, the skills, the mindsets that we're wanting students to be able to do by the time that they leave K-12. So these are K-12 standards. And do you have questions for me I could help answer? So we don't specifically, for just a reminder for Oregon, we don't have currently socio-emotional learning standards. The standards that are socio-emotional learning are embedded in other content areas. So you'll see them in health, you'll see them in the school counseling program standards. You'll see them also in like social studies, social science. You could kind of like pull them out from there. And we also have the early learning. Oh, Holly added in. Yep, the early learning kindergarten guidelines also have socio-emotional learning standards embedded within.
Okay, so I have some questions.
Yeah.
So who is using these standards to design what?
So these standards are used in all the school counseling programs. So all the schools, they should be being used to design their lessons, to design like goal setting if they're working in small groups. Maybe some students there's some skill sets or some areas that teachers have identified, students have self-identified, parents have identified, counselors have identified, or administrators, others in the building maybe have identified that the student maybe could work towards. So students can also do a self-assessment and use it to like help with their own growth. So they're used for also for so basically they're to help the students grow in the areas where these domains are not the domains, but like these different categories. So like the learning skills, the self-management skills, social skills, to be able to grow. And so they're just working towards those skills and whenever needs were identified, areas identified.
Like in PPS, it's tricky, and I think it's tricky for us here on the thinking statewide is we have counselors, the counselors are building lessons, SEL lessons, using these standards. And then, like in PPS, now we have the SEL team that's in a completely different department selecting SEL curriculum. And so then you have this, we have to be working together, and then also territory. So then it becomes two separate bodies of work. So that's why it's really good for us to be thinking about alignment, but it is, I think it's pretty problematic. And as we think about the standards, how do we align them, make sure that that we can crosswalk.
So I was going to say, Jill, have we crosswalked these with, like, for example, the castle, where they fall in the castle framework?
Yep.
And that would be
crosswalked, and we're vetted to CASEL. I've had them vetted.
Right, but to actually show people where in the competencies they fall, I think, as Jill was talking about, so they're not seen as separate, as how do we really intentionally bring them together for folks? And I think that, like, even though you have done that, but is there a document that we could use to?
I do have a document. It just hasn't been posted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would be great.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about how this applies at the universal level. So like, tier 1, because I know that sometimes counselors, as was it Jill that pointed out, sometimes counselors are the ones implementing SEL. Sometimes it's a student success coach, or sometimes it's the classroom teacher. I feel like that's where it gets kind of tricky, right? Because I think as a standards group, we want to think about who's doing the implementing and what our kind of goal is, so that we don't have these cross bodies doing it. I think that's a tricky piece of that.
Yeah, I just know, so like when I'm working with career lessons or the school, like the socio-emotional learning, or if I'm doing some of the college career, I already said career, but college pieces, I would look at what standards would would attach to lessons that I would be providing, whatever I was going into, whatever activity. So we asked them to look at counselors to look at what they're already doing. Maybe where are they co-teaching with other teachers? How can they embed the lessons in so that it's aligning with what their activities are doing in the classroom with that teacher. And then when you're thinking tier one, so Jill, you mentioned about the classroom. So like if you're going in and doing by grade level, you're basically, they should be mapping in districts and in schools, they should be mapping where these are being addressed at what grade levels. They don't all have to be addressed. And like, for instance, all of these don't have to be done at elementary level. They should be K-12 developmental over time. So you would see these happening at different grade levels and then mapped over those years of when they're being implemented or delivered.
I'm glad that you're saying that, Beth, particularly the coordination. What I've noticed is that sometimes school counselors are very siloed in their approach to SEL. And I'll give you an example at Lincoln through the health class and in conjunction with a student club that we had. It was called SAFER, and their purpose was to teach students more about consent and what that means. So they put together amazing presentations for other classrooms around the issues of consent. The latest research, they had amazing guest speakers. They were on point. And then about a month later, the school counselors, because they had to, they were told to, went into the classrooms to give their lessons on consent. And they weren't as good, quite frankly. And they hadn't checked to see, do our students already know those skills?
Mm-hmm.
Have
Yep.
those skills been taught? So that one of the real concerns that I have that I know you all share is that we work together on these standards and that we're not siloed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I'm sorry.
Oh no, Jill, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna think, yeah, like Deirdre's question, I think is connected to what you
Right.
were just saying, Jim, too, is that it's like, who are these for?
Mm-hmm.
And for what are essential questions. So like in PPS thinking, like, we have health who's doing a health adoption. And then they're looking at second steps for violence prevention. But SEL is doing a curriculum, adoption. And then counselors are creating their own lessons. And then the content areas are adopting lessons that have embedded SEL skills teaching, right? And so in my mind, I'm thinking on one hand, you have these discrete areas that are teaching skills to kids. And so we can do standards that address skills to kids, for kids, like counselors. And I think from what we are all saying is that we're looking at the impacts of like bigger things that are more like climate-like issues, like trust and sense of belonging and relationship. Those things are, tier one systems, and how to frame those so that they are student outcomes. But I think in our heads thinking this is for a system, not our own set of discrete skills, because then like my fear is that they'll be washed down like, okay, here's a great shiny language arts curriculum. And I can say, oh, here's the skills in these lessons. We've done SEL. And I don't think any of us want that. So who is it for? Is it for a system, climate? And then how do we turn those into actual student standards? But I think that's an important question.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think that goes with where the framework is and the coordination. So I know that, like, for instance, working with all of the 21 districts that belong to the WESD, it's really looking at that mission and vision for SEL and where does it fall and who teaches it, etc., because it belongs to everyone. It can't just live in separate in the counselor's office or in this person's classroom. And so how do you really, and in a place like PPS, it's broad, right? Because you've got so many different entities working on something. And I think that is the real work. It's not the, I mean, we could have the best standards, but it's really the coordination of how we roll it out and working together and who's doing what. And like you said, is it who's doing this piece? And, you know, I was thinking about what Jim and all of those things is so complex. It's really a shift in mindset of the way that we have done education, I think, right? Is so it's like, because it belongs to everybody.
And that's the beauty, that's the power, the transformative power that
Yeah.
we have in our hands right here.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. Because I think you look at some standards across the country and it's very like the onus is on the students, right? And you can see them as like, okay, is this student showing empathy? Is, you know, I think that's exactly what we don't want to go towards. But if there's some way that we can create a part of the standards to be about these systems working together, right? So that the onus of meeting the standards is actually on the adults. And part of that is collaborative integration of teaching and thinking about, and I feel like that's possible. I don't think I've seen a great model of that because I do feel like it oftentimes is like centered on what are the competencies of the children? But it sounds like, Jim, you have something to add to that.
I sure do. I do know a great model, and that's the whole child model, because it really identifies all of the stakeholders, including the students, everybody that we're talking about, including the community, and including school climate. That is also one of the pillars.
Are there is there anything in the whole child model that would help guide like writing of standards that you could share with us? That
Yeah, I'll send
be
you all-
helpful to see like what the way in which a standard is written.
I think a lot of that work we'll have to use our own fluid intelligence to kind of say, all right, how does the whole child model help us identify the stakeholders? And then from that, Jill, if I understand what you're saying, how does that inform writing the standards themselves? So yeah, I'd be happy to send that information out to everybody.
Jim, is that the WISC model?
Yeah, the WISC model.
It's
Yes.
the WISC model. Okay. So I wonder if that's something we could look at, just as I'm sorry, I'm taking notes and trying to
Suzanne
capture
can
everyone's
also,
thought.
Suzanne is a massive proponent. So our health standards person, she loves the model and always promotes it. So she could probably do the health standards and that together
Okay.
next time she comes.
I
Yeah.
also think that we might be conflating a framework also with standards themselves. So standards are what students should know and be able to do, or what people should know and be able to do, including adults. So a framework is really the context in which that comes to life. So I think about, I guess they work in conjunction with each other, but this is like more of the nitty gritty. And then the framework is how it all fits together.
And I think that that's why we need to be very careful about just adopting a castle strategy. And then those are our areas. Because with the whole child model with other stakeholders, we're talking about health standards. Where does suicide prevention fall within social and emotional learning standards, anti-bullying, social justice, those things that are typically left out of a castle model. So I just want us to be very, very careful of wholesale adaptation of the castle model, because it leaves out some of those whole child model stakeholders completely. And they have important standards that we should really address.
Yeah, and I never said anything about Castle. I was just saying like a framework in general, like what is the framework that we're looking at? So
Yeah, I think it's tricky because like CASEL is a framework itself as well. It's not an approach. It's not a program.
It's
It's
not
a framework
standard.
for what are sort of these more microscopic, more micro skills that are practiced, right? And so the whole child model is much broader, right? It's talking about a lot of things. So I don't think it's one or the other. Like, I think what we're talking about is sort of different levels of this, right? So the CASEL model is looking at sort of what are the kind of micro skills that a kid or an adult has to maneuver through in these different areas and in these different places. And so can we be working on those skills in different places? Absolutely. And in different contexts at different tiers. But I'm also not, this model is like much broader. And so I'm not ready to be like, oh, CASEL isn't broad enough, because another real issue in social emotional learning right now is it's people are trying to bring in too much. And so we're trying to like make it the umbrella for everything else, which it shouldn't be, right? Like it's its own thing. It isn't, it might be related to trauma-informed practice, and it might be related to culturally responsive practices, but it isn't those things. It's related in more in a Venn diagram type thing. So I just want to be conscientious of that too, is that we keep that micro level of what are we talking about in terms of what are the skills that we want to help kids grow in as they maneuver through all these different areas and in their life, and at a, like really a universal level, right? So if a kid isn't being seen, in a targeted way, how is a typically, developing kid moving through our educational system and getting practice in these skill areas and learning? So that's that. I just wanted to throw that out there, that I think there's just multiple different types of frameworks. And so when we're talking about standards for SEL, I'm worried about it getting too big, because then we're just kind of like making an all-inclusive framework of something.
That's helpful to hear, Deidre. So we don't want it too big. We don't want it to be too small. We want it to be that Goldilocks position in the middle. Yeah, I am afraid that it's going to be too small and too narrow, so that again, we'll just see like school counselors in charge of SEL instead of everybody. That's my real fear.
Well, and
Well,
I think
go
it
ahead.
will be in the curriculum. They'll check the box, because with all of our new curriculum adoptions, there's SEL standards. So I'm thinking like looking at, so another thing is that the standards force the system to change theoretically. So even if you have like these counselor skills, create relationships with adults that support success. So that's, not what we want to say, but some skill like that then forces the adults to create a relationship with the students. So thinking about, if sense of, you could break that down to smaller discrete skills of what's required to do that. But if we could write it, those larger, broader skills that force the system and the adult to do something, then we're impacting that change.
And and from where my experience and from where I've sat, and having standards, regardless of whether they're English or math, doesn't force change, right? It's the practices or how people interact together that makes that change. So we've seen that with Common Core, for example. There are still many places where that hasn't even taken effect, right? And so the idea was for that to change practice. And so we could, again, I say we could have the best standards, but it's the practices behind it and how that, how we interact with each other and really change the shift our thought process, so that it doesn't just, again, fall like this is, in the counselor's office, for example, or the counselor's doing something totally different than the classroom educator, etc. So
Yeah.
it's really, thinking about being intentional And that's the hard piece. That's the mind-boggling, like, pit in my stomach. Like, how do we actually think about approaching education differently?
Yeah, yeah, you're such a downer there, Holly.
I'm sorry, Jill.
When I said it coming out of my mouth, I'm like,
No, and
this is basic, philosophy that has never come to fruition. So when I was saying it, I was like, huh.
But it's a great idea,
Sorry,
it's
Jill, and I'm
like-
not meaning
like
to be a
Reaganomics,
downer
like-
or to go against what you're saying. I wish it
No,
would. Like, I
but
wish it would.
is there a way to have a transformative power or not? I mean, or is it also just keeping it on the table in the state of Oregon before it gets wiped out by school boards?
Yeah.
Exactly.
what
That's
about-
another thing, Jill. I don't want to be a downer though. I'll be an upper. Maybe these standards will change transformative.
They
Anyway.
might, right? I mean, what if it went back to, again, who are they for, right? And what, I don't know if we can do this, but like, what if there was a section for students, like things that we hope students get, but a section for an adult, so that the SEL standards for the state, there's the kid standards, which are the things that we're hoping they're learning along the way, and maybe they're learning it from here or here or here. This is a very broad, team. I'm sorry if it's like too broad, but then there's like an actual section of like, here are the adult SEL standards. And so the SEL standards for Oregon are not just student centric, because we're recognizing the adults SEL in all of this, and that they have a responsibility for that piece. I don't know, is this a already done idea or not good idea?
No,
Well,
we actually
starting
talked about
adults,
this last time we met, about the need for the adult piece of things, and how do we not reinvent the wheel, but how are they integrated and supportive of each other and doing the work? Because, while I actually like Holly Dalton's little dip, because it reminds us that the importance of a framework and why we need to go really big, and it has to be all the stakeholders, right, in a district and an organization. The capacity and the probability of it happening will be much greater if that is like a belief and a value, and a shift in paradigm and what we believe school should be about.
Mhm.
All of those pieces play into it.
Yeah, and I am not trying to be negative, but I, think our system needs to be a little shaken up a little bit. I don't think it's working for people.
So we have one more minute for this section.
All right.
Great. There you go. Put the big one in there. What is SEL? Yes, that is something that we're grappling with, right? Not just in our own internal group, not even just in our own advisory, but just all over the nation. Like, what does it mean? And people are conflating it, making different associations. So yeah, I think that's a really important question to consider. And also, Beth, just pointing out that the bill and the language in the bill is very clear that the charge of this group and the guidance that needs to come out is how it will be incorporated into the content standards. So we need to be thinking about what that would look like in terms of how those would land.
And then the last thing that I think about too is what's the teeth in this?
Kate Brown.
Isn't she on her way out, Jill?
As I think about how to approach it, because I feel like there is a sense of alignment. I feel like those questions that I wrote down have emerged. Like for me, it's like how do we choose the little bits without understanding the bigger questions? Like, how are we defining SEL? And then who is the audience? The bill there gives us who the audience is. And then what are the major goals, right? Which is aligned to, I think, well, how we define SEL. So, because then that goes to the question, well, we have different frameworks. So you have the whole child framework. Castle has a framework. Castle has competencies, and then they have equity competencies in there. So those are larger, bigger buckets of competencies. So as you choose then framework competencies, we can't really do that without knowing what is SEL. How are we defining what is SEL? Because SEL could be a set of skills that students have to be successful in life. It could also be, is it the identity, agency, belonging, that transformative SEL? Is there an equity piece in there? So I find it really hard to go forward without answering that question. Not to be a downer.
No, I agree. It makes it very difficult. And Beth, I was reading your teeth.
Yeah, I'm just thinking the teeth of like the benefits. Like we know that we're like out of all the states nationally, like lowest for like the greatest number of mental health with.
Yeah, just came out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been the last few years. I think the last 3
What are you
years.
talking about? Can you explain? No.
What's
I
that?
don't.
What are you
sorry,
talking about?
Well, just like the data that has come out recently, well, even over the last few years, has been that Oregon is ranked like one of the lowest in the nation for like the greatest number of young and adolescents with mental health that are being services. And so that kind of like raises, like elevates, like why, like around the why we need to address social emotional learning and mental health and well-being of our students and adults as well. That's another high. The data was also high. I can get the research article that came out. There's actually several that I can provide.
I don't know if it's required here, but I'm just curious, but that would just be I'm not familiar with that research, but I don't know if you don't need to spend time on it just for me.
It's pretty amazing too. And I mean, you're preaching to the choir Beth, but I'm talking about like for change in education. What's the, I don't know.
I know I was thinking like, okay, like improved academic outcomes. Like if we want to see our students improve, like administrators being to like address or help support their own staff in their mental health and well-being. Like I'm just thinking of like the benefits of why we're doing this, like the teeth. To me, like teeth doesn't have to be like a law or policy. It could be like the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So how are we feeling about pausing this conversation? Not to say that we won't continue it, but we do have some other things that we had identified as things that we wanted to look at in our time today. So just looking for you all, does it feel okay to move on and do a little bit of research into what other states have looked at? Okay. And we'll keep returning to this as we kind of see some of the connected SEL work across other standards. And so I'm seeing the need for Suzanne to not just talk about the health standards, but also the WISC model, and to kind of give us a sense of what that looks like. We can add that to our time. So on item number 6, if you'll open up the standard state scan, and I can also place it in the chat. This is just a tool and a way for us to just capture what we're seeing and what we're liking. So we had identified Illinois and Massachusetts as states that we wanted to look through. And so we'll provide some time for us to just kind of look through them, maybe about 5 minutes, and be thinking about what is it, what's something in this that you see that you may want to aspire to, or that you think Oregon should aspire to, that you're seeing that's something you want to elevate or surface? What might be something that you want to argue with? So something that doesn't seem right or is not giving you that feeling that something's missing, or it's not very comprehensive or not very deep. And then what are some things that you may want to act on? So what are some things that you may want to actually have us think about and move towards action in what you're seeing in these two different sets of standards? Before we start though, does anybody have familiarity with any of them prior to us coming together? Like, and if so, if you'd be willing to share like what you know about the work happening in these states.
Yes, we have used Illinois in the creation of the WESD SEL framework and standards. So I do. And we're missing a S on Illinois.
We got to add it.
I like it without the S though.
I know that Massachusetts is one of the states that's kind of farthest along in integrating their teacher prep program standards with their K-12 standards. And I think they've been sort of a model for that. And so I think that's where I've seen them. And it's something that I would aspire to, given the fact that we're doing this work simultaneously with TSPC.
So Deidre, can you say more about that? Because I remember you saying that, and I looked around and I couldn't find anything specific to that, at least not on their actual website. So maybe it's on the teacher side of things, but I didn't see that integrated.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm not sure. I don't have a website like off the top of my, but I just know about that from, oh boy, conversations. I talked to somebody in Massachusetts at some point when I was developing the UP program, and they were recommended to me. And I think Kristen's been pursuing it too, Kristen Rush. And I think she got farther along in the process that I did and was possibly going to meet with them.
Okay.
So I'm not exactly sure. I just, I guess that was more anecdotal rather than I have a piece of actual evidence to show you that.
Yeah, no, that's good to know, because then we can reach out to, and I can connect with Kristen, because that's what was appealing about this particular model, right? That they were kind of integrating those two.
Mhm.
And that is what the charge is for Oregon between TSPC and ODE. So that would be really powerful to look at.
Yeah, I think
Sorry.
Kristen's been pursuing it a little bit more. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, I asked how these two were going to intersect with TSPC, and the answer was we don't have to. And I said, well, it'd be nice to row in the same direction. So we'll push that as stakeholders as well. And Deidre, I put in the chat that one of the where the report comes from, the hopeful future, so you can
Oh, thank
peruse
you.
that
Thank you.
on your own time.
I also know Illinois being related to the Washington standards. So when Washington sat down to do their work, I do think that they looked at Illinois as like a preeminent one. I think it's not an accident that Castle's in Illinois. So just throwing that up there.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't we take maybe 5 minutes just to look over the Illinois ones, and then if feels right to capture your thoughts on that document, that's great. If not, that's okay too. We'll come back and just kind of share out what we're seeing.
So just the Illinois one right now?
Yeah, we'll just take it one at a time. So that's 5 minutes. And again, I think, we had said we would look at these ahead of time, so most of our time spent together would be around our conversation. So if we can come back to the group. And maybe let's start with some things that,
Liz, are you talking to us?
yes. Can you all hear me except for Holly?
You can hear her, Jill? Technology.
Oh, no. So what do we want to start with? Aspire, act, argue, all? What's coming up for you as you're looking at this?
Somebody put performance, and that was a big, someone want to talk about that because that was a concern.
That was me. I feel like it's like when you have like performance competency, it seems as though I'm trying to get to a certain place. And to me, social emotional learning it's about a process of interacting in the world and with other people and yourself. And so I get concerned about using performance competency. I think skill somehow is okay with me. I don't know what other people think about those kinds of things.
I'm with you, Deirdre. I think performance has a finality about it and these are like life skills that we're all working on. I see myself on some of these being very early in my development, and somewhere I'm a little better, and depending on the context, I could change within that. And so I think that just begs the question, like, who is judging? Like, who's judging the performance? And what can happen when someone is judging a performance? Like, what can come to play? And I'm thinking about potential biases by teachers.
That's what I put. How do differences fit in cultures fit in? Because there were a lot of very specific things that I felt were culturally biased. And it worried me.
Can you give an example of those, Holly? Because I'm sort of a proponent sometimes of specificity, because I think it sometimes in standards, if we're not specific, it can
Not
be.
to this level.
But I don't know. I think that's, it's tricky to say they're all, but I
will find one while other people talk.
I think a related issue is how do we measure growth on these standards? That also informs what standards we write. We have some rubrics for growth, both at tier 1 and then more and more at tier 2 and tier 3. I use our SEL standards for IEPs for our students with emotional disturbances. And I have to figure out different ways to measure their growth, both in observation, but also according to those standards. Something like the social skills improvement system aligns absolutely hand in glove with the CASEL standards. Others don't so much, but maybe some of the standards that students might be working on are more related to mental health. So I would use more of a mental health assessment than a CASEL assessment for them. But then that's tricky. That brings in culture as well. How do we measure schools' performance on these standards? And how do we measure individuals' performance on these standards? And do we call it performance? What do we call it?
So Deidre, an example would be use puppets to act out and resolve conflict situations. Why do I need to use puppets, right? For example, let's, why? There's no reason why it just has to be, puppets. And then I think it is so daunting for anybody, an educator. It's too much. It tries to incorporate everything in here, and then there's not a lot.
I'd say too, the whole concept of self versus collective.
Mhm, mhm,
It's very individualistic.
mhm.
And, obviously certain cultures don't view it as self. And that's actually offensive. And then also not privileging the community and collective nature. And that's, I've had conversations with Castle and just full transparency, I am not a Castle lover or hater. We work with Castle and they provide some useful things, but just want to put that out there. But they're, the people we work with do have a problem with like self-management, that is problematic, and puts the onus on self. So you have that culturally, and then also what we know about neuroscience and our co-regulation. So anyway, that's what came to mind. I mean, there were some decent things in there, but.
And that's where I started, Jill, was the ownership and all of these is on the students and where the educators fit in. It's like they don't have them, but it's not like it hasn't been instructed. So it starts with, yeah.
Well, and just everything is the self, is what I do as an individual. My emotions, my regulation. And, as humans, it's not just an individual act.
I like that, Jill. Ken Wilber is one of my favorite theorists, and he talks about the 4 quadrants. One of them being individual, and the other being collective. And then on the y-axis, the externals for individuals, the externals for communities. And then on the other side of that axis, the internal for individuals, the internal for collectives and communities. I find that just a very helpful way to think about things, because I do think SEL standards get collapsed into the external individual quadrant.
I think that's not sure how to keep that in mind, but I think that's a great something to think about as we consider this.
I mean, couldn't we use that as a guiding framework for how we create the standards, right? If we're talking about the fact that we don't want it to be student-centered, what if in the creation of these standards, we used that framework to guide kind of how we organize the standards? Because I think there is obviously, I think there's all the elements, just like you said. I think that's a really great point, Jim, that I love the axis. I've seen something like that before. And it makes a ton of sense, and also sort of marries with what we're talking about being like the onus can't just be on the students all the time. And we don't want these standards to be just standards for children to be measured on, right? So that gets super, super tricky. But there are skills that kids can be working on, as you pointed out in, the IEP realm.
Or is the skills of the working around in anyone, right? I'm still working out my skills, right? I think about like I didn't want to offend Jill in the way that I said something, but I hope I didn't by saying that. That wasn't my intent.
No.
But the way it came out is I couldn't do that, right? And so that's my self-awareness. I'm thinking, crap, that wasn't the way I intended it. So I think it's a lifelong skills.
Yeah. I just put,
Jill, sorry, I didn't.
and
mean to
Holly, you
offend-
did not offend me at all.
Okay.
But thanks for saying that. And because you don't know me. So we'll work on our social skills. But if you look at that link I added there, the second, I just copy and pasted. I don't know if this is the same 4 quadrants, Jen, that you're talking about.
Let's see. This is in the castle and equity.
No, the one that right below that, refresh, I just added this.
Okay.
Do you
I
see
just
the
put in
green?
the chat some language that we use
Oh.
too, because these skills don't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah. No, Jill, it isn't the same one.
Oh, okay. Will you share what?
I shall.
I really appreciate this conversation because I've been stuck on that self piece a lot. And I think that thinking about it and the possibility of having it be balanced, and not that we don't all have to work on self things, because we all do. And we also have to work on things collectively. We all do. So I think it just creates that opportunity to hold space for both of those. And so that's been like a really good reworking
Yeah.
for my brain.
And none of us do it alone, right? Again, even as adults, like it's the collectiveness. We think about how we interact with others, so
Or not.
or not.
I love how that's framed, Holly, with support from.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that that's perfect. I mean, that's what we're using, but I think that the onus is not on the student themselves. It's everybody, and how do we frame it to have that onus? Jim, you put that in there. Okay.
Yeah, we'll make sure to include it on there. I will say one thing I did like about it is that it did say why this is important. Like, I think that's really helpful language that anybody who's attending to the standards can surface and speak to. I think oftentimes we don't involve students in why we do things or why we're working towards things. And so I liked that each one of those kind of shared why that competency or that skill was important.
Jim, the way you said it made sense, but this graphic is beyond me. It doesn't connect with what you
Agree.
said.
That is probably exactly, yeah. That's basically the philosophers quadrants there. They're the same quadrants. And he's talking about growth in a different way than we do in education. But this particular, just the bare bones of those quadrants have been used in business and education and the arts, in all types of different endeavors. So I think really just the verbal description of the quadrants is probably going to be more helpful than what I just sent you. We can think in our own ways about how standards fit into those four quadrants. Nobody has to be a geek like me as far as developmental theory and evolutionary theory.
I think we all are in our own ways, Jim. I would aspire to be in that category as well. One thing, Vanessa, I'm thinking about as you were talking about the goals or the why it's important, and I'm putting myself in the lens of a student. I still don't understand the why behind it. So yeah, I love that we're thinking about the why. But to me, as an eighth grader, I have an eighth grader and a sixth grader. I'm thinking about him saying, I don't care, right? I don't care about this. So like, why would this be important to a person? Like really distilling it down. I like the way that you're thinking the why, because I agree that that's really important.
Goes
And I
back
also
to
think
what is
people-
SEL?
Right,
Say
what
it
is
again, Jill.
SEL? what is SEL? She asked, and also even just asking, I think that's kind of can be really powerful exercise with students to ask them, why is this a standard? Someone somewhere decided this was a standard. Like, I think to unpack that can be really powerful too.
Yeah,
And to be fair, we don't do that very often with students in our standards, right? I mean, we've
Not
got
at all.
so many different standards that a kid is not going to have some, so I feel like it's a great idea and could totally be done. But I would hesitate to think that we need to write the standards so that the students completely understand on their own the purpose of the why, like, I think that's a little bit challenging to get to. But could that be used as a reflective tool in the, process of building these things? Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
Jill, I love the fact, and I keep going back on, I agree, we need to kind of define what we're saying SEL is, right? Really, that's hitting home with me right now.
So let's get to that, because that's kind of our next step.
Okay.
Is thinking about that. I'm looking at the time. We have about a little over 15 minutes left. So we did not get to Massachusetts, so we can decide to look at that next time. If that's what the group, how are you all feeling about that? Do you want to look at Massachusetts next time when we meet?
Yes.
Okay.
And will you said, Vanessa, you're reaching out to Massachusetts because of,
I can reach out to Massachusetts. Yeah, I'll connect with Kristen. I see her on Friday, so who's working on the TSPC side of things. So I'll see what she's found out, and then if not, then I can reach out and just ask them about the adult piece of it and the integration.
Do you want a name?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
So Deborah Donahue Keegan, I'm not exactly sure. I don't know her. I just know of her. Tufts is really somehow integrated through SEL for Oregon. And I was told that I had some conversations with her over email. She goes by
Awesome.
Deb. But I had conversations with her like 2 years ago, and it was about the creation of the UP program. But she generally knows about a lot of things and in SEL. So she would be, and Tufts has been doing SEL at the like holistic school level, like at the higher ed level. So they've been integrating it. So I guess she does research in that area. She
Cool.
might be someone to start with.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to have a lead. So thinking about our February 28th, the way it's looking like is we had a group, we invited folks to come and help plan and design our agenda for the 28th. And we got some really helpful feedback and input about what the hopes were for that space. And one of them was that folks did not want to sit and get information and be like passively listening to reporting out, but really creating spaces for dialogue, for questions back and forth. So it's looking like we will be moving into smaller groups, and there'll be a person that is from SEL, from engagement, someone from standards, and someone from framework. So there'll be smaller groups of 4 or 5 folks, and that each person that's on those teams would kind of share summaries, bring up any tension points, questions that we're kind of mulling over, things that we want to hear from, the larger group. So one of the things that we identified in our last meeting was this idea of an SEL definition. Can we have a common definition for SEL? And is that a worthy pursuit for us to engage in? And that really this would kind of be the bucket work for this group to come up with some sort of definition to bring back. So that was one of the things I'm hearing again today, that is kind of, we want to talk about that. So that's one thing that we've identified, right? Like, do we want to consider that? Do we need a common definition? Other things that you're thinking that would be, that you want to hear from, questions you have, so that when we all go into those spaces, we can look back at this and say, oh, yes, right, these were the things we were going to ask and get some ideas or conversations going. Like, I'll just pose this question. Do we want the framework groups to consider this concept of the quadrant?
Yes, but without the Wilbur. Nobody needs that.
I just feel like you could draft what you said, Jim. The way that you interpreted it, like it just made a lot of sense. And if we could, it also just makes sense to not have it all be so linear, right? So just this idea of this quadrant, just visually, and I know that, you know, that is not always the end all be all, but this idea of understanding that there's these different quadrants and for all the individual stakeholders in the development of social emotional skills.
Right, and might not be linear either, Deidre, right?
Exactly.
So I feel like it's not linear
Mhm.
because you bounce back and forth between, and then they may overlap as well.
Mhm.
There's always interaction going on among the
Yeah.
quad.
Yeah,
Mhm.
could be the Jim Henson's theory.
Oh, look, there's been a good deal of research on they call it the aqua model, all quadrants, all lines, all levels within education. So take a look and I'd be happy to put together something very simple, but maybe perhaps helpful in the way that we conceptualize this. Simple is good, parsimonious is good.
Yeah, Jim, if you could do that and share it with myself or Beth, then we can include it on here so that those of us that are in the engagement group, we can kind of pull it up at that time to share this
Right.
idea. Because I will say the framework group right now is going on a very different path. They're really thinking about the conditions. I guess it's not too different, but they're really thinking about the conditions that are going to allow SEL to be supported in an ecosystem. So not so specific to standards, but more just generally what would need to be in place. What are the elements? That's kind of what they're looking at this time.
Will Suzanne be talking to them as well, Vanessa?
Suzanne from Health and PE.
Eddie, yep, about the whole child model.
No, but we could.
Jim,
That might be
I think I'm on the framework. Jill, are you on the framework as well? No. Deidre is. No.
I
I
don't think
don't
they-
even know who's on what. So
That's
but-
because Holly, we're also on the TSPC one, right?
great.
So it's like,
That's where I see it. And Jill's on that too, isn't she? No.
nope. I don't know either.
I'm just gonna keep my mouth shut.
So much cross-pollination
Yeah.
going on right
That's
now.
good.
Deidre, you're on all of it.
That's why Deidre, I get confused too. I just accept when anything comes. So I can't keep track.
So I just had a quick question for next time. Oh, Jill, sorry, go ahead. Oh, no, just in planning for next steps. Do you want to, does this group want to review what other standards have been developed around the state for system emotional learning? So we know that there's some regions, districts that have developed system emotional learning standards. Do we want to look at those as well and hear maybe like how they were developed and what they are and look at those besides just other states?
I'd say at least just their standards, at least. I don't know if, if there's somebody that's really out there and how they developed it that we could learn from, but.
Perfect.
And I'll put in the chat. Ours is, we're releasing a new competency this month. So we only have two on our website right now. But we can look at that too.
I guess a question for the engagement committee would be, so if we're charged with defining SEL, that feels like so important. So it'd be, how do we engage? Would the engagement committee be able to help foster some engagement around that? And
That's a
given our
really-
timeline, it feels impossible, but I'd hate to define it without, this 5-6 white folks. I think white, I'm assuming white folks.
Jill, that's so important. And I was thinking, how does that intersect with the engagement group? Because I think that's huge, particularly with our socio-political context.
So it's really tricky. I will say, like, the
me.
engagement group was wondering about that. Like, do we keep it open-ended?
Yeah.
But then the task, right, they're trying to figure out what is it that you all will need to help frame specific to you all the standards. So they have to somehow define it to get an idea of what the standards would be that they want to see in it. Or do you go the route of just asking what it means? So it's really hard to do both. It's really hard to do both. Because right now, and I can share with you the questions that they have specific to standards. I have to pull it up, but I think their question is really pretty basic in that what are the social, emotional, oh gosh, I should pull it up. Hold on a second.
Got it. Do you want me to
You
add
have
it in?
Beth? Yeah.
I do. Do you want me to just add the one for caregivers, communities, and the standards?
Yeah, I would just use the standards one.
See this, so because this question is implying a definition of social emotional learning. It's implying it is be able to know and be able to do. I don't know.
Right. So Jill, so initially we didn't have it with even the word social emotional learning, and we framed it as, what should your student outside of the content areas, academic, know and be able to do? And then folks in the engagement group thought that was not particularly transparent about what we're trying to do and being forthright with our charge and our scope of our work. So they wanted to use the word social emotional learning.
But I think you could ask that question in such a way that defines it, that helps let different communities define it. So like your first question that you just said there, that they thought was too vague. Like, I feel like you could tweak that a bit so that then the responses help to define it, so what, I can't think of what it is right now, but do you know what I mean? So like, what is it that
I totally know
supports
what you mean.
your student in blah, de blah? I don't know.
It's very
We're-
hard.
We're trying to keep from leading. I think the
Yeah.
group was looking at how can you word it in a way that doesn't lead them to it, but lets them kind of define for themselves. So at one point it was like, okay, let's just have them define, like, what is social emotional learning? How do you define it? And then it gets into what knowledge and skills was kind of like the next one, but then it ended up combined to try to make it sound like they wanted it clear, concise, together.
But this is good. This is where, on Monday, you'll be able to provide that feedback.
Yeah, and I wonder though, this is pretty academic language, social emotional skills. I mean, it's not that it takes, highbrow, but and there's such misconceptions out there that this is now a loaded question. And so I would be concerned about that without having some parameters till you're hiding.
Yeah, that was also discussed, was like, with the social emotional learning being kind of that, trigger for some people. Is there a way to word it in a way that was kind of like like those competencies or like this knowledge skills, and word it in a way that way? But the engagement group wanted to stick with what was in the law, what was said in the law, and call that out. So that's how it ended up in the question.
Right. But if you really want to truly engage communities and not, we need to think about changing the language in there a little bit, even though you want to stick with the law. People don't necessarily know what that means.
Agreed.
I think that means that's why we have to put out a definition of it. And
Yeah.
I really hesitate about inventing new definitions, right? Especially with something that has 2 decades of research behind it.
Mhm.
It's like, if we are talking about growth mindset, there's a definition for growth mindset. And if we're straying from that definition, then we're talking about something else and we're not doing a service to the field. And I mean, whatever construct we're talking about, right? If it's an established construct, I think that it isn't a discussion here for what social emotional learning is. It's a discussion for a larger field. I mean, and is that worthwhile to have? Absolutely. But is that what we're tasked with? And that I worry about sort of the Pandora's box of us trying to redefine social emotional learning as a group, when there are many working definitions that are very similar, that are used, right? And so that's the same thing like with this. There's another construct like social emotional cultural competencies or social emotional learning, and if you shift it, then people are like, well, what are we actually talking about, right? As opposed to providing a definition. We're saying what SEL is, and then here's what it is. We're saying like what critical race theory is. We're using that term, and then we're defining it. We're not trying to redefine what these theories and constructs are. We're being clear and transparent about what they are.
Oh my gosh, so much good thinking. I feel like I could take a nap.
Okay.
That felt good. We're just going to wrap it up because we're at time. So just one way to kind of bring us to a closure for right now, to be resumed and to be continued. This is such amazing work. And I think we're getting to know each other, getting to know what our needs are. All of those things are really important and part of the process. So we appreciate all of you. And if you could just share one thing you're now thinking, feeling, and or wondering, whatever makes sense for you in terms of that sentence frame. And Jim was like, I'm out of here.
Oh, Jim left.
Oh no, he did leave a note. Holly, overwhelmed.
Oh, Jill, good. Yeah, I'm engaged.
Yeah, Jill.
Too. Jill's on fire today.
Yeah, some good coffee, I think.
Mhm.
It's fun. It's a really fun, engaging conversation with you all.
It is.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
My brain needs it.
Beth, you want to share?
Curious. Yep. Leaning in, curious.
Well, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah.
Hope you all get to take a little nap at some point. Catch you later. Bye.
Thanks. See ya.
Good to see all of you. Bye.
Bye.
Great talking with you all. Really
Yeah,
fun.
good to be with you.
Great.